Well, hi, everyone, and good evening to folks who are joining us live here. My name's Andrew Hyde. I use he, him pronouns. I serve as the ecumenical campus minister at the University of Guelph. It's a real treat to invite you into this conversation, conversation we've been looking forward to for a few weeks now. We're going to have a little bit of time here with a friend and colleague of mine, Reverend Adam Kilner. Adam is a United Church minister from Sarnia, Ontario. He is an accomplished theologian and historian and a faithful servant in our church. He's also an accomplished musician and artist. We're going to hear a little piece of his music at the end of our time together as well. And in the most recent election, served as an NDP candidate for Sarnia Lambton there too. So there's so many ways that Adam pours into our community, and we're really glad that he's taking the time to have a conversation with us today. Our conversation is around Black liberation theology. And kind of comes out of some of the conversations we've had at ECM and on campus and in our campus ministry about how to respond to so much of what's stirring in our hearts around racial justice. And as Christians, we want to reflect theologically on that. And you can't go too far into reflecting theologically on racial justice before you come across Black liberation theology. So we wanted to invite a good friend in to come and help us kind of become a bit more familiar with that little piece of our rich Christian tradition. So it is a real honor, a real joy to welcome Adam, Reverend Kilner, into our midst tonight. Adam, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for making time for our campus ministry and for this conversation tonight.
Always a joy, my dear brother.
Awesome.
Always a joy.
I'm trying to think when we first came across each other's path. I think we've been in ministry probably about similar lengths of time and stuff. And I always remember you playing music at Crux of Fusion events and things like that. But it's been a good little while that we've never ministered in the same town or anything, but we've crossed each other's paths a number of times and stuff. Eh?
Absolutely. And that song that you're going to play at the end is I played at the last Crucifusion with Lisa Waits, and I had somebody playing the cajon, and I can't remember who it was, but that's the only time I've really ever played that song live anywhere, and so hopefully people like the recording.
For sure. Adam, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself and what ministry looks like for you these days? One of the treats, even just apart from the conversation we're going to have tonight, is just introducing our campus ministry folks to cool ministry colleagues and showing folks what ministry can look like. What does ministry look like for you these days in Sarnia?
You know what? I never thought that I would go. So number one, I'll just say my name's Adam Kilner. I use he, him pronouns, and maybe before Andrew gets to it, I'll get to it. I live on the land of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe, and I also recognize the heritage and gifts of Métis people. This is sacred land that people have lived on for at least the last 15,000 years. But in response to your question, the powerful thing has been, or maybe I should say it this way, I never thought I would go into ministry and become a televangelist, but that is what 2020 has become. So I'll be able to run my own TV show, I think, by the end of this pandemic. It's been a huge learning curve, and I totally understand a lot of those articles about ministry burnout, especially during the pandemic, because it's a huge challenge. I've been so blessed to have a congregation that has been so supportive. Any of the, sometimes we get nitpicky in the church about this or that, but I've not experienced that in any way, shape, or form. I've experienced simply people appreciative because of the huge amounts of isolation that people are experiencing now. So ministry mostly looks like me sitting on the phone all day talking to people from my house, doing the rare graveside service, we've now typically got maybe 20 people coming into the church building itself on a Sunday. And so that was a dissonant experience after about 6 or 7 months of just me, a singer, and a piano player in the sanctuary, kind of speaking to a camera. It all of a sudden became like, what? There's people? Now I have to talk to both. And now we're also going through a nesting agreement with another church to have kind of them join us. And so like I would not recommend going through things like amalgamations and nesting agreements during a pandemic. It's another thing, to add when you're already inundated. So, and that's not to say that, we don't appreciate Central United that's joining us. It's just to say, the amount of work is about quadrupled in the middle of a pandemic.
Right. Yeah. They often say, like ministry is a great field for those who like adventure and like a little bit of this and a little bit, like there's always something new, challenging on your plate and stuff. And, I'm thankful for the ways you're responding and for taking some time to be with us tonight too. I'd say one of the little like side benefits of this season is that like normally if we were to like, bring you to campus to, do a PowerPoint presentation or something to that, it'd be this whole big ordeal to organize. But this is great. Like we're sitting on our chairs at our homes and stuff and just kind of chilling out and able to do this, which is maybe a little side blessing of these times, eh?
You know what? That's been one thing that I really think has been, it's something that I really hope that we carry on beyond the pandemic. The not having to drive anywhere to go to a meeting, has been a huge. It's been a huge advantage. At the same time, some of us also need to learn boundaries, and when I say some of us, I mean me, because sometimes I schedule meetings back to back to back because there's no travel time between, and I got to learn to just be like, no, I got to space out these things.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's dive into it then, Adam, and we'll pick your brain here a little bit. Somebody described you as the church historian on William Howard.
Oh, you mean Wilbur Howard?
Wilbur Howard. Yeah. Sorry, the first United Church Black moderator and stuff. And so, you come into this conversation with an expertise, maybe that, we're going to maybe put to the test here, or hope you'll be gracious with us too, as we're on the learning curve here for many of us and stuff. But we want to dive into Black liberation theology tonight. And for some folks, that's a very new kind of language, or new kind of didn't know that was a thing, right? And so for some of us tonight, even just knowing that that's a thing, that you can look up and do some more exploring on, will be great. But sometimes, like when I think I had a conversation with someone who had wanted to do a little prep work or do a little bit of learning, and got on this whole, like how you go onto the internet and you go down all these rabbit trails and stuff, and found that like liberation theology is, this whole wide vista of things. It's a bunch of things, right? And so like there are forms of liberation theology that have to do with queer identities and womanist theologies, and like theologies of disability, and there's the kind of classic liberation theology that we think of out of Central America with Oscar Romero and, like advocating for the poor and things like that. So I guess just as a way of entering into our conversation around Black liberation theology, can you just paint us a little picture about maybe what some of those things have in common? Like if you were to say, like, what is liberation theology about, generally speaking? What might be a way into that conversation in general terms before we get into specifics?
Yeah, I would say, so the first liberation theology originated in South America with regard to socioeconomic circumstances. And a lot of that stuff is related deeply to Western patriarchal colonialism. And but the simple thing, the simple way of describing any liberation theology is to talk about agency, the agency of those who are engaging the process. Agency is always about the ability to possess a certain form of power or autonomy over your own life or over your own community. Mm-hmm. So it's really about not letting outside forces have the final say in what goes on in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Is what I would say. So if I'm gay, I should be able to say, well, you know what? Nobody should be able to stop me from getting married. If I'm Black, nobody should be able to, stop me from being able to get a job where I'm adequately qualified. If I am Indigenous, nobody should be able to stop me from leaving the reserve. Unfortunately, if I'm a woman, nobody should be able to say to me that, there are certain places, where I should be able to, exert power, and certain places where I shouldn't be able to. Mm-hmm. As we saw recently in the American election, yes, a woman should be able to be vice president. A woman should also be able to be president. And I think that's true when we talk about corporations. We should be able to have women CEOs, and we are seriously lacking in that capacity as well. But ultimately, a liberation theology is about historical power, how it impacts local communities, and how those local communities and individuals actually respond.
Yeah. And like, if you were to pull out biblical themes, or what are there biblical stories that kind of are linchpins for thinking about that power and that agency, theologically? Would liberation theologies, emphasize certain elements in the scriptural narrative, maybe more than others, maybe?
Oh yeah, and long before, we call James Cone the father of liberation theology, but the reality is that this thing that we call liberation theology predates James Cone. It's just James Cone systematized it into a theological structure. We have folks, Harriet Tubman, long before James Cone ever came along, 100 years before, was called Black Moses. Pointing to the story, that central motif throughout the Bible of Israelites being delivered out of the hand of slavery in Egypt into the promised land. That kind of trope or theme, whatever you want to call it, was used throughout the slave trade to refer to the northern states and Canada as some sort of promised land. Now, we in Canada have kind of taken on that kind of theme as this idea that we were actually some sort of promised land, but folks forget that we had 205 years of slavery in this country. In the first century of our slavery, we ended up having, it was predominantly Indigenous slavery. And it took on a very different look than what happened in the US, mostly plantation-based, but not solely plantation-based. Here in Canada, it was mostly the building of large government and corporate buildings. People wouldn't necessarily live on large plantations. They would live in the households of those enslaving them. So I would just say in all of this that I don't know that's one biblical theme, the biblical theme of being removed from slavery.
Right.
But I wouldn't say that that's the only theme. But I think throughout our conversation, I'm going to lift up a few more of them. But the central one, I think, that everybody should be aware of is that particular one. I think it's really also interesting to look at the first two chapters of the book of Exodus, because at the start of that chapter, the Pharaoh, this is part of the story of Joseph, the Joseph who had the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It starts in the late chapters of the book of book of Genesis, and flows in to the first couple of chapters of Exodus. And Joseph has died. A new Pharaoh rises up who doesn't know Joseph, starts oppressing the Israelites more than they were being oppressed before. They start crying out. And then it says that God all of a sudden leaned in and heard the cries of the people and started to remember the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The covenant, of course, a couple of those covenants were about Abraham's descendants. They'd be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the sands on the beach, and so on and so forth. But that Pharaoh begins oppressing, saying, look at all these foreigners here. They're going to do something to us. If we don't do something about them, they're going to do something to us. And that's part of the xenophobia that has existed in the Western world, North America, South America, with regard to indigenous folk. We could have a whole long conversation about the 100 million indigenous folk who became victims of colonialism in the first century after that whole thing began. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, but like colonialism that continues in its varied forms today, right? I remember I follow William Barber II on great civil rights leader these days in the States and stuff. Great on Twitter and stuff. And as I was, getting to know him a little bit and stuff, I would see him and others using the hashtag to kind of call out, some of those problematic dynamics, particularly in the States, but also existing in different forms here. But the hashtag was hashtag slaveholder religion.
Yeah.
And sometimes, kind of coming across different spots that use that language, of seeing remnants of, what was called slaveholder religion versus a different religion, a slave religion. These are like, you've mentioned Harriet Tubman and stuff, but in days way before James Cone, different theologies being lifted up, that kind of sing a little bit the song of liberation and stuff too, but maybe predate, kind of what we typically think of as Black liberation theology and stuff. Can you speak a little bit about that difference between, what you might call slave religion and slaveholder religion, and maybe just kind of lift up a few more of those voices, pre what we might think of as Black liberation theology. I guess is all Black theology around liberation? Is that, I guess, maybe another way of kind of coming at it? I think of like Martin Luther King and others like that, who I might not think quite the same way as I think about James Cone and some others. But
Right.
I don't know. What? How do you respond to some of that?
I mean, that's all of these, no matter how broad or how simple the questions become, because we're talking about a nuanced demographic of folks, it is still a very nuanced conversation. And what I would say, There are, ultimately, I would say that most Black theology that you'll find is a liberation theology. In fact, where Otis Moss III right now is Trinity United Church of Christ. For 40 years, their pastor was Jeremiah Wright, a well-known Black liberation theologian. Unfortunately, he retired early due to some comments that the white population really didn't like about that he stated, in which he damned America, questioned Black people worshiping the flag, and he did that based on social conditions, the social conditions that Black people have to regularly endure. Right. There are portions of society even today, particularly in the evangelical and fundamentalist world, who view Black theology itself as heresy. I don't think it's a large group, but there are people you can easily find just by Googling Black liberation theology. You can find, I think one of the first 3 articles is exactly that. Going into the history, it's a fascinating thing, because when I was thinking about one of those questions that you had asked, my first thought about slaveholder religion versus slave religion was the story of Charles Colcock Jones. Charles Colcock Jones was a Presbyterian minister. I think he originated in Georgia. And he was very active in the 1830s to the 1860s, maybe as early as the 1820s, as a minister. And so he wrote this book called Catechism for Colored People. And his job as a white Presbyterian minister was to basically control the slave population. So he went down, I can't remember where, but one of the southern states, and preached a sermon in front of thousands of slaves. And he used one of those texts, wives obey your husband, slaves obey your master. Those words appear in at least 2 different epistles in the New Testament. Yeah. And his point there was to tell slaves that they shouldn't be running away. They shouldn't be trying to escape slavery. And I remember that looking at his diary from that day, his diary indicated that the feedback he received from the slaves was they didn't care if they never heard him preach again. So that's a demonstration a little bit of some of the historic roots around what I call this kind of white patriarchal Western colonial religion, and why people like Malcolm X would call it the white man's religion, because he's experiencing it as a form of social control. These slaves would have been receiving it as a form of social control. On the other hand, however, you're going to get there were slave revolts were not common, but they did happen. And 3 of the examples that I can think of include Gabriel Prosser. Gabriel Prosser saw himself as kind of a Black Samson, if you remember Samson from the Old Testament. And he saw himself as Samson and took on this divine mandate to free slaves from their oppression and establishing a Black kingdom in Virginia. Obviously, he led an army of 1,000 against Richmond and was ultimately unsuccessful. I mean, these slaves, what weapons did they have access to? Pitchforks, probably, was about their best weapon. Whereas, the militia and or military in Richmond would have had guns, right? Yep. So you see Gabriel Prosser, you see Denmark Vesey, who was a Black Methodist who saw himself as Joshua, remembering the Battle of Jericho. He declared that he was guided by the Lord in the vision or in the form of an angel with a sword, and he took arms up against Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And before he could take action, his plans were, of course, thwarted and foiled, and he ended up on the executioner's block. The last one would be Nat Turner, that I can think of, who made a declaration of holy war against Southampton, Virginia. His plans also, just like Denmark Vesey, were thwarted, and he ended up on the executioner's block. But as he was led to the gallows, he did remark, "Was not Christ crucified?" Mm-hmm. And so this kind of liberating spirit, this way of hearing the gospel from the vantage point of the enslaved, of the oppressed, of the marginalized, isn't about social control. It's about liberation, and so we'll probably talk a little bit about James Cone and the ways in which Jesus or God is black. James Cone constantly told white people that they should see themselves as black, and so that's it's a way of expressing what the prophets do throughout the Old Testament, what Jesus does in the Gospels, which is hearing voices, being found in situations that would shock people because they're voices that we normally don't want to hear. Mm-hmm. And it's peculiar that anyone would call it heresy, because I would call Black theology coming from a different vantage point than what a lot of us grew up with, but I wouldn't call it heresy because it's rooted in Scripture as far as everything I've read and interacted with.
Right. Wow. Yeah. You mentioned the story of the white preacher coming to preach the Pauline epistles to the slaves and stuff. I remember reading Howard Thurman telling a story about his grandmother, her experience hearing preachers in under slavery, and how that same kind of dynamic. But there would be every once in a while I think once a month, a lay Black preacher who was also a slave would be able to speak, and would speak from the Gospels, right? As opposed to the Pauline epistles, right? And she's like, it was only out of a Black voice that we actually heard the stories of Jesus, because Jesus was being a liberator, as opposed to other attacks on the Bible that are maybe less liberative, right? Like sometimes we can use theology to preach liberation, or we can use it to preach the status quo, right? Yeah. And how dangerous it can be when it's wielded for unhelpful purposes and stuff, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Malcolm X, and kind of the critique against the white monopoly, I guess, on Christian theology, and how when we view it through other lenses and stuff, different things kind of come up for us. There's also this story of Stokely Carmichael, who, at least as I am familiar with it, ended up being like critical of Martin Luther King for kind of his tactics, or maybe even just the gospel he was preaching and stuff. My understanding of Black liberation theology as being kind of trying to be attentive to the voices like the Carmichaels and like Malcolm X and stuff, and kind of springing out of that kind of Black power movement, and wanting to kind of claim agency. Do you see like when I think of like a lot of people are pretty easy to ascribe, get behind Martin Luther King and nonviolence, and kind of have a Christian imagination for that. but react kind of differently when people lean into the parts of Christian theology that claim liberation and claim agency for the oppressed and stuff. Can you speak a little bit about like why some people respond differently to Martin Luther King and like what was Black liberation theology? What itch is it trying to scratch? And maybe speak a little bit about James Cone, who's kind of a bit of a leading voice, or kind of the typical voice that we kind of ascribe to Black liberation theology.
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I think it's a really complex thing. But one of the things that first jumps out is, one of the things that particularly white audiences can do with Martin Luther King is they because he has a lot of quotable quotes, they can manipulate what he says so it sounds good to them, rather than contextualize what he's saying within the confines of the movement that he's leading. Martin Luther King was an exceptional leader who tried to bring to the table many different voices, and in fact, even in his own council, many voices didn't agree, with the absolute determination to be nonviolent. So Martin Luther King himself did have to spend a lot of time behind the scenes where nobody was looking, and watching, and really gather people around a common vision. People don't often understand how challenging that is. Another thing I want to say about Martin Luther King is that today, people will use Martin Luther King's words to say you shouldn't riot. And the reality is Martin Luther King understood why people rioted. So that does not, when people are using Martin Luther King's words, against rioting, and it's not that Martin Luther King was in favor of rioting. He was understanding the social conditions that lead people to riot and to loot. He understood that people were in such desperate circumstances that this was the action they were taking that they could feel would lead those in power to hear their voices. That's what Martin Luther King was about. Martin Luther King, a lot of people don't understand or know, was arrested and at least 30 times during his civil rights movement advocacy. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. So Martin Luther King was arrested at least 30 different times. So you have to understand this was a revolutionary figure. At the same time, you had folks like Malcolm X, you had folks like Stokely Carmichael, and you even had people like James Cone who thought it didn't go far enough. Mm-hmm. They thought that Martin Luther King's vision did not advocate enough for their needs, for their agency. This is not to say that they didn't appreciate Martin Luther King, because sometimes the best way that we transform our own movements is to have critics present. Mm-hmm. So I don't even if they were at odds with each other, with public comments about this or that. They're trying to fuel this thing called Black liberation, not Black liberation theology, but just the liberation of Black peoples. And so the last thing I want to say in the modern world is that Martin Luther King, we manicure and deodorize his commentary, and it's really unfortunate that we do. Cornel West calls it the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King, the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King, where we turn So what we do with Santa Claus is we take this ancient Turkish saint, and we turn him into kind of this manicured and deodorized version of himself. And now he's from the North Pole, because we could never accept somebody from Turkey as a gift bearer to us all. He would throw gold into the stockings hanging over people's fireplace mantles, especially those who were poor and marginalized. And that's the same thing that we do with Dr. King. Is we take this very nuanced, peculiar figure who led America and the world in many respects through a profound, a profound experience of trying to navigate race relations, and now that we've got that the U.S. has a holiday for Martin Luther King, we all think we were on his side. But the reality is there continue to be marginalizations in our world today. And if we are not on the side of the marginalized, we probably historically would not have been on the side of Dr. King.
Right. Sure.
So, that's the challenge. And, folks like Stokely Carmichael, folks like Malcolm X, folks like James Cone and others, Malcolm X, for example, wasn't shy that he thought total nonviolence was insane. And he died the same way that Martin Luther King died, an assassination. So
yeah.
I don't know if I should say anything else, but that's kind of what I got.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it is interesting what we often do with figures and stuff. Now, we've mentioned Dr. James Cone a couple times tonight. I was watching a thing you had done with Hub, this great network of United Church camp folks and stuff. And in your talk there, you had suggested that folks pick up a copy of one of his books, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and stuff. And so picked that up and read it over the summer on your request and stuff. But for folks who are maybe less familiar with who James Cone is, can you just paint us a little picture of him and maybe some of the who he was and some of the things that he put forward, and why is he such a big figure in Black liberation theology? He's kind of looked up to as even though there's this whole history of liberative theology by Black people, he's kind of lifted up as kind of like the grandparent of Black liberation theology. So why is he such a big deal?
Well, I mean, to look at James Cone is to look at the story of every Black person. From my recollection, he grew up in the South. Ended up for a doctorate or a master's degree, something like that, ending up in the North at a white university, having to navigate being Black being the Black person in a white school, in the very first chapter of his book, said I wasn't going to tell nobody, which was the last book released before, or maybe just around the time of his death, maybe just after, something like that. He talks about unmasking, this piece of work that a lot of Black people have to do. He talks about how in his early years he did what a lot of Black people do. We just remain silent. We don't tell people where we're coming from because they'll view that as an attack on their person. Particularly white people. If I disagree with you, that's an attack on your person. So James Cone tells the story of eventually getting to a point of unmasking. And this for him happened in the 60s. It was surrounded by the Black Power and Black consciousness movements of the 60s and 70s, that era, on the tail of the Second Vatican Council, which would have ended in 1965. And 65 would have been where, it was in South America. That's where we would have seen the liberation theology, the South American movement, South and Central American movement begin, right on the coattails of the Second Vatican Council. So Dr. Cone would have been watching that and developing his own theology. Why is this? So he looked at, was surrounded by white theology that he didn't see making sense to him as a Black person in America. Why, why do I need to conform to this overarching European understanding of who Jesus is? Why do I need to conform to a whole bunch of mores and cultural norms that do not exist in Black communities? And when I read the Gospels, Jesus doesn't seem to think that we all need to fit Roman norms, and the Romans were the occupying force in Jesus' homeland of Palestine. So when we look at questions like that, it becomes clear. Dr. Cone sits in a classroom listening to people talk about a white Jesus. And finally, he gets to a breaking point because he's been listening to this day after day after day. And he says, no, in order to be a Christian, you need to become Black. Jesus was Black. And so you need to become Black. He told this to white people. You need to become Black. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that, and I don't speak for Dr. Cone in any way, shape, or form, but what he's trying to point to is this Jesus who saw. So I guess the best way to put it is many of us come across folk who identify as agnostic or atheist who criticize this idea of an invisible God. Mm-hmm. And I guess from Dr. Cone's perspective, his criticism of Christianity isn't an invisible God. It's the very fact that we make certain people invisible. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about an invisible God. It's about tending to people that we view as invisible. And a great story from the Gospel of Luke is the story of a rich man and Lazarus. The story, the tale is of a man named Lazarus who is begging at the doorstep of the mansion of a very rich man. It's really interesting. The rich man is never named in the story, but Lazarus has a name, and that would have been significant for first century Jews. Your name was your identity. Mm-hmm. And so for the rich man to remain unnamed in that story is a fascinating thing. They both die. One ends up in Hades, the underworld, the place of the dead, and the other ends up in the bosom of Abraham. We might call that heaven today. And they have a conversation across the great chasm that exists. And the rich man continues to try to get Lazarus to do his bidding. Well, eventually, at the end of the tale, the rich man who is in agony in Hades says Abraham eventually says to him, no, Lazarus can't go up and tell your siblings about your condition, because if they're not going to listen in this life, they won't even listen if somebody is resurrected from the dead, which I think is a very fascinating foreshadowing. But the point in that story is Jesus tells and retells and puts himself in positions where he is interacting with marginalized, invisible human beings. So Christianity is not about, is not fundamentally about being enamored with an invisible God. For in Jesus Christ, Christians actually have a visible God. Our fascination as Christians is a fascination with a God who calls us to work closely with invisible people. So that's the perspective that James Cone is coming from, and he's speaking particularly about his own community that are living in poverty for the most part. He's tired of that, sick of his voice not being heard, which is it's not different from queer theologies. It's not different from womanist and feminist critiques. It's not different from other theologies that come from below.
And like just you're mentioning around, like aligning with invisible people and seeing folks too. Like I hear echoes of that in this, where Dr. Cone his argument is basically like, we've tried to not look at the legacy of violence and lynching in the States and the violence perpetrated to Black bodies, let alone reflect theologically about that violence, right? And so like I see another kind of image of like seeing what we often try to not see or to reckon with things that maybe challenge the nice stories we try to tell about God in our world, right?
Yeah, exactly. And a couple really powerful pieces from that book for me are at the end of one chapter. I can't remember. I always have it bookmarked, but I never remember the page. But at the end of one of the chapters, he talks about how Martin Luther King was a great student of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a great philosopher and theologian in and of himself. If Martin Luther King learned a whole lot from Reinhold Niebuhr, but the favor wasn't returned. And if it had been returned, the dynamics of even the conversation that we're having right now might be dramatically different. And that's actually what the gift is today, is that we get an opportunity to do what Reinhold Niebuhr never did. This is about opening opportunities to see where other people are coming from. The other piece I would say that's really touched me in a powerful way. One of the things you had wanted to talk about. I don't know if we're going to be able to talk about it because of time constraints, but criticisms of Black liberation theology, and my fundamental view is that any good theology that has no critics is probably not good theology, because a good theology is constantly transforming as it enters new contexts. But one of the things that really jumped out at me a number of years ago, there was this massacre down in a Florida LGBTQ plus club. It was called the Pulse Nightclub Massacre.
In Orlando, right?
Yeah, it was. Oh, sorry, it was Orlando. Thank you. And dozens upon dozens of people were murdered. They were just going out to the club, to a club where they knew they would be safe. And one of the things you'll find in James Cone's book is a direct comparison to, not that he never mentions the Pulse nightclub, but he does name how on Saturday nights the Blues Club was a safe haven for Black folk, and on Sunday morning the Black Church was a safe community space for Black folk. So the church wasn't simply theology wasn't just about being spiritual. It was about community organizing. It was about theology. It was about dining together. It was about a whole group. Like, it was about the vast expanse of what it means to be human. And but the simple comment about the Blues Club being the safe haven on Saturday nights, that's a direct this is why I think even if there are critics, there are also in many of these marginalized communities, there are direct comparisons, that we can make about the safe places that we find for them. The other thing I wanted to mention was just to say that, I think a good criticism of this Black liberation theology is that people are weary and concerned about its ability to connect in a healthy way with LGBTQ plus folk, and with women. Just like so one of the things that we keep forgetting is that this most forms of leadership in North America and even in South America are it's white patriarchy that generates our leadership, and many even marginalized communities internalize that for themselves. So I don't think that it's wrong to criticize that. I think it's actually more important, because you cannot change something if you do not criticize it. And oftentimes people who lead movements will not be open to those ideas, but I think movements do have to change. And in order to find liberation, one does actually have to engage those conversations. I do not myself, I do think it's probably fair to suggest that the Black church is rather socially conservative. At the same time, I think it's rather fair to say of Black folks that they're actually, if you look at American statistics, it's, they tend to be actually less, less marginalizing than other racial groups. So there may be some sort of thing that happens when groups get together, and we don't want to be cast out of the group. And it also may have to do with the kind of leadership. Somebody's viewed as a strong leader. We gather all sorts of power is gathered around them, and if we ever say anything against that, we're cast out of the group. And I think so these are really complex conversations. I don't like to leave these things in their simplicity, because I think they feed into false narratives that can emerge. So yes, as an enterprise, the Black church is probably in many ways its own version of a white patriarchal colonial system, and that due to a lot of it being a reaction to a white patriarchal colonial system.
Sure. Yeah. And that might actually be more about the nature of institutions and stuff too. Like, I remember some of this came up. Professor Barrington Walker gave a presentation last year that some of us went to about the Black church as kind of that social institution in Canada, and was lifting up some of that history of the AME church and the BME church in particularly in Nova Scotia and things like that, and raised some of those kind of dynamics when you realize the pressures that those communities held as being a safe haven, that you put up protective walls around that sometimes, and sometimes that causes people maybe a scarcity of imagination to think widely too. After reading your recommendation, I picked up Kelly Brown Douglas. This is kind of a classic around particularly some of that work around the Black Christ and different ways that it has been that saying that Jesus is Black or Christ is Black has been imagined by theologians. And Kelly Brown Douglas raised some of those critiques around, the church, Black liberation theology and LGBTQ imagination and womanist approaches and stuff too. But what I love too is that, like, she's now the James Cone faculty position at Union Theological Seminary. And so I love that idea of like, critique isn't necessarily opposition, but rather it's loving stewardship, right? Is that, you love this tradition too much to let it, not be all that it can be and stuff too, right? And I caught on to some of those themes in her work and stuff too.
Yeah, that's a really great way of framing it, and even when we look at the Canadian federal system, the actual title of the party with the second most seats in Parliament is called Her Majesty's Royal or Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, and that's it's really important. I think in our personal lives, I think it's really important in our professional lives, and I think it's really important, if we're leading movements. So, for example, one of the more recent stories is that of Zoom, and everybody has their own opinions on this video conferencing app Zoom. But I remember just as the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, all of this information about Zoom having major security flaws came out. And within about a month or 6 weeks, something like that, all of a sudden they had major patches that would stop people from being able to get into, to Zoom bomb and all this kind of jazz. And I think when I was reading about their founders' story, one of the things he identified was that actually people who offer their own critiques are actually our best advocates, because they help us refine a product that was meant first and foremost to be people-centric. And I think especially in the church these days, where we see everybody paranoid that churches are dying, I think that's a really important thing to take into account, that we're dealing with human beings first and foremost, people who want to be heard, who want to be acknowledged, and that's one of the fundamental takeaways I get from that story at the end of Exodus 2, where Pharaoh increases the workload for these slaves. And they start crying out. It never says they pray, but they just start crying out to God. And God remembers the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in the depths of our misery, whether we call it a prayer or not, if we're looking for divine guidance, you can think of Bart Simpson in one of those early seasons of The Simpsons, just telling God, I only pray when when I need something. But we think of that as a bad thing. But I think, God likes to be acknowledged, but I think we also like to be acknowledged. And that speaks to something primordial, something at, the very essence of what it means to be human in my sense. So I don't want us to lose that, and I think that's where those criticisms come, is here's what you're addressing, but here's also a bunch of stuff you're not addressing that is also dearly important to me as a Black person, right? So that's exactly why I've gotten involved in the Sarnia Pride and Transgender Association. That's why I've gotten involved in our community legal assistance clinic here in Sarnia, because of those very pieces. There are people without access to housing or legal care who have no other venue to be able to name a form of social misery. We have people who are gay, lesbian, transgender, two-spirit, queer, and so on and so forth, who have no other venue to share who they are. And I think that this is what the heart of a Black liberation theology and any liberation theology is really about. It's about being acknowledged, and being equipped to share your own agency with the world, your own power over yourself, and your community.
Yeah, and I think too, like if you can't express your situation and feel heard and acknowledged and seen, that feels like a real early first step towards finding like agency over your surroundings and your freedom of movement and body and prosperity. And like if you can't give voice and be heard, that's you don't stand much hope of feeling free in this world, right?
Exactly. And I took a course in dealing with conflict a couple of years ago, and we learned the SCARF model. And the SCARF model is this model. I can't remember what every single piece of the SCARF model stands for, but SCARF all status and the A stands for autonomy, and these are all things that people will react against you for displaying. If Andrew, you and I are in a meeting and I just start going off about how terrible a person you are in the middle of the meeting in front of our peers and colleagues, the likelihood of you voting down anything that I put forward for the rest of the meeting is very high, right?
Yep.
If I don't let you, let's say you work for me and I never let you do, you bring up ideas and suggestions for job improvement, and I always say, no. That's me stopping you from being autonomous, using the gifts and skills that you have to do your job. You've been trained, you know this or that, and me as the employer is saying, no, I don't care what you know. Mm-hmm. So from that point on, it shouldn't surprise anybody that you might not feel so warmly towards me, right? And I think some of these things that we're dealing with are about conflict management. They're about why would people be rioting and looting on the streets? And if you think that you can't support something because of the rioting and looting, then what you've already said is, I don't care about the social conditions of these people.
Yeah.
But if you're willing to look underneath and start investigating and saying, I wonder, and I really do want to know, then you're able then to hear some commentary that you might not want to hear. Mm-hmm. But at the very least, it'll open your world into a way of seeing that you probably could never have imagined on your own. And that is, like I say this as a Black man who is not poor. I do think we all need to recognize where we're situated, and that some of this rioting and looting that we've been seeing are coming from populations who feel that they have no other economic way of dealing with the political stuff that they are facing. And this is stuff that they face in their everyday lives. How do I let the government know that I'm not doing well? Yeah. Because they can't hear me in any other circumstance.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Oh, wow. Adam, our time is coming to a close here. I want to give you one last little section here. If you were just to speak a word of encouragement or a word of direction to some of our students at the University of Guelph, particularly thinking of students in our campus ministry who are, maybe wrestling with how to be faithful in areas of social justice, racial justice, or maybe even to some of our Black students who are imagining the church and their space in it and stuff like that. I don't know, what are just a word or two of encouragement or direction that you might offer to some of those folks, either from your own experience or from some of the reflections that we've shared tonight on liberation theology and the Black experience. Maybe just send us into the night with maybe some parting gifts and wisdom here from you.
Two things come to my mind. And the first one is just from 2 years ago. I was down in Montgomery and Birmingham, Alabama, and I met this woman, an elderly white woman. Her name was Jean Gretz, and her husband's name is Robert Gretz. Everybody just calls him Bob, but I've never met Bob. He just died a couple of months ago. And Jean just shared her story. Jean and Bob, white of German ancestry from Pennsylvania, came down in the 50s to serve a Black church, and what they ended up experiencing when they chose to serve a Black church is the same violence and marginalization and oppression that Black folk experience on a regular basis, or were especially at the time. Tires slashed, 5 or 6 or 7 children in their house, and 3 attempted bombings, social marginalization, ostracization, I should say. And I look at those folks, I look at Bob and Jean, and I think, this is exactly what it means to be an ally. I'd never heard of them before, but they've stood up for what it means to be Black, what it means to have dignity and still not be Black. They didn't become the voice of anybody, but they stood alongside and said, this is right. That's really shaped a lot of what I think allyship is in the last couple of years. Another thing that I want you to know is that, you might be a Black student who's especially in perhaps a mainline church. I grew up in a mainline church, and a lot of our mainline churches, especially the United Church, they tend to be predominantly white in most places that you go, and I think that's fine, because the reality for all of us is that this resistance to white patriarchal colonial structures isn't a battle against anybody being a white person, right? A white individual. It's a battle against these historic powers and structures. So what I want to say to you tonight is, I grew up in a church predominantly white, and I come from a family of 10 adopted children, and I just remember as a little kid, I must have been 8 to 10 years old. My sister, the church quilters had put up 2 banners, and they said things like, each one of them had 3 sayings: receiving, giving, praying, this, that, and the other thing. And they all had white hands next to them. And my sister whispers over to me in the middle of the church service, "Where's my hand?" And that stuck with me. I went up to the minister at the end of the service and said, "Where's my hand?" And I pointed to the banner. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, we come in and 2 of the hands had been replaced, one with a light brown to highlight Indigenous folks, and another one with a darker brown to highlight Black folk. And what that did for me was tell me, I am seen. This church sees me. This church is my family. It doesn't matter the color of people's skin. When I named, where am I in this picture? They didn't turn it into a political arena or anything like that. Folks went back and said, you know what? Where is Adam? Where is Mandy? Where is Amy? Where is Maggie? Because I can't see them in this picture. This shows you that people can genuinely care for each other across demographic lines. We just need to appeal to the best sense the best senses in each other. So what I would say to you as a student, what I would say to you as, especially as a racialized person, but even as a white person, you know, trying to advocate, I would say the best way to advocate is to appeal to the best nature of other people. I can't tell you the number of times I've come across people who've claimed they were the polar opposite end of me politically, but if you sit and listen and you understand their viewpoint, they are transformed themselves. Sometimes you have to put up your, you know, your boundaries and say, this is where the buck stops for me in terms of what I'm willing to accept. But at the same time, to see someone else's genuine humanity. So friends, as you go from this place, I pray, and I pray that you continue to meet the challenge. Canada is not going to be any better than the US for racialized and marginalized and even white working class people and vulnerable people if we don't have advocates like you. So thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it, and I thank you for investigating all of you know, all of this this stuff on Black liberation theology.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Adam, for being with us. You know, it means a whole lot, I think, when someone in our wider church, someone of your stature and leadership and stuff, takes time to be with our university community and stuff. Sometimes in the wider church, campus ministry is sometimes overlooked and stuff like that. So we give lots of thanks for you taking the time to be with us, and for the leadership that you show in our church and the faithful work that you are called to, and that you are doing so patiently and you know, faithfully. Even in hard seasons like this one too. So thanks for being with us tonight. We're gonna end off.
Big hugs to you.
Hey, there it is. We're gonna end off with a piece of your music. So do you want to take a second and introduce what we're gonna listen to here, and then we'll play it out. And while the music is going, if folks want to add in a little comment or a little reflection and stuff while you're listening to that music, would love for you to do that and stuff. But yeah, let's play it out with I've Got This Freedom, another side of Reverend Kilner here, the musical artistic side. Do you want to just say a word and introduce this for us?
Yeah, the song came out of just an experience at a time. I'd gone through a very challenging, you know, couple of years of my life, and I was sitting down. I was listening to Aretha Franklin's "Mary, Don't You Weep," and you know, some other gospel songs, but that's the one that was most prominently in my mind. And just sitting at a keyboard one day, feeling the thump of gospel music, and I just felt like I was starting to see the glimmer of light of a new day, and that, you know what, maybe I was gonna make it out okay. And when I brought it into the studio, my buddy Adam, who is a close friend and my recording engineer, he said, "This is the song. This is the song." So hopefully you enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, this is the song. Thanks, Adam, so much for being with us. Thanks for all you do. And if you want to get the album, where can we find it?
You can find it on Spotify, on iTunes, on Konaki, on Amazon Music. Anywhere you find it, 40% of the proceeds will go to a local Kiwanis club in an elementary school. They're called Builders Clubs. So 40% of the proceeds of the sale and streaming of this album have gone to that Builders Club, which hasn't been able to meet, of course, due to COVID. But that Builders Club is a predominantly Indigenous school. And I know, just talking with the principal, I know that Builders Club, which we founded, has transformed the culture of that school.
Wow, amazing. The album's called Freedom Tapestry, appropriate for our conversations tonight. This is I've Got This Freedom. Thanks so much, Adam. Appreciate you so much.
Is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
In my soul, nothing can contain it, only God can control. Sometimes feel in prison, Lord still has a song. We've been made last for the nighttime, but my praise is rising strong. I've got this freedom, oh just give me that song. In my soul, nothing can contain it, only God can control. Sometimes I'm in prison, Lord still has a song. We've been made last for the nighttime, but my praise is rising strong. I've got this freedom, oh just give me that song. I've got this freedom, bless it all night long. And my troubles overwhelm my spirit, but I've got this freedom. Whoa, darkness comes and I don't know where I'm going. Daybreak soars and I know I'm rising strong.
We've been oppressed so long, but tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality.
I've got elation deep in my soul. Nothing can contain it, only God can control. Sometimes